So by now, I hope you're starting to realize that Kant's system is very complicated and ambitious. I almost wanted to say overly ambitious, but I'll hold back for any criticisms until later in this lesson. In any case, we begin with belief in the power of courageous reasoning. Kant truly believed that through pure reason you can establish certain fundamental truths, not only about reality but also about morality. Key to this is his notion of synthetic a priori statements, things that are known, basically blends of concepts, right? Things that are applicable to the world but are known through reason alone, a priori. So there's also, at least when we begin to talk about his ethics, this insistence on free will. So Kant is not only building a metaphysical system and an ethical system, but a defense of free will, because this is, coming into question during this time period. It should be said that the problem of free will, skepticism about free will, has been around since ancient times, and right around the time that Kant dies, we actually get yet another attack on free will, maybe one of the most powerful ones in the history of philosophy, by a French mathematician named Laplace, Pierre-Simon Laplace. And so Kant wasn't around for that, but it's something that he kind of constantly kept thinking about, free will, the freedom of the will. Of course, he's building a system that's defending moral law. So he's, in a way, if you want to see Kant as a conservative reactionary, that kind of does make sense. I mean, he's trying to reestablish, let me just bring in this last one in here, belief in God, belief in tradition, right? So belief in the immortality of the soul, ethics, freedom of the will. He's kind of reasserting the power of reason. I mean, if you want to call this time period not only the Enlightenment, but also maybe the crisis of the Enlightenment, how so many traditions were being called into question because of the power of reason and science. So Kant is definitely seen best within this context. He's trying to reestablish some beliefs that might be cast by the wayside if it weren't for Kant's courageous work, right? So with all that said, I think now we're finally ready to look at his actual ethical theory. Now, his ethical theory happens to be called the categorical imperative, or his command from reason is called the categorical imperative, and we'll define what that means in a second. But actually, I'd like to introduce Kant's ethics through a little bit of social psychology. So this is one of my favorite social psychologists, Daniel Batson. And Batson here is talking about motivational systems, the human motivational system to be exact. And he distinguishes between 4 different types of motivations. There's egoism, which is a motivation to serve your own interests. There's altruism. That's when you're motivated for the sake of others. Collectivism is when you're motivated for the sake of the group. So, if, for example, a soldier sacrifices himself for the sake of his platoon or his, nation, that would be a form of collectivism. And principalism, the motivation is to abide by some moral principle. So if you think about it, you probably have acted according to one of these types of motivations in the past. So you've definitely acted for your own sake at one point, but you probably acted for the sake of someone else at some point too. Collectivism, I'm sure you've done this too, especially around maybe political problems or something like that. But principalism, that's when you are motivated by some moral rule. That's what drives you. And that is exactly what Kant had in mind. So let me take this here from the slides. If the moral law is to be a law, then it needs to apply to everyone at all times in any given context, just like gravity applies to everyone at all times. This moral law, then, is a command from reason, and one's actions only have moral worth if they are done out of respect of this command from reason. Two things are being said here. Number one is that this is a law. It is something that we are establishing through our reasoning faculty. And laws, just like the laws of nature, they're supposed to be universal, applicable at all times. So forget, interstellar travel and all that stuff right now. Gravity, if you're here on Earth, applies to everyone at all times. And so the same goes for the moral law. Now, the second thing to be mentioned here in that second sentence is that it's only a moral action. It only has moral worth if you did it out of respect for the moral law. If you did the thing that morality commands, but you actually didn't do it because you were following your duty, if you actually did it instead because, you wanted to feel praise, or you felt ashamed not doing it, or something like that, then that doesn't count for Kant. The only way that your action has moral worth is if you did it fully out of respect for the moral law, because of the moral law. That's why you did it. So, with that said, the categorical imperative is, according to Kant, a command from reason that applies to all people at all times in any given context. He claims that the categorical imperative can be formulated in 3 or 4 equivalent ways. So Kant actually gave 3, but commentators kind of read a 4th one in there. So I will mention that 4th one, and I'll let you know which one it is. Let's begin with probably the most popular formulation of the categorical imperative. And this is the universal law formulation. Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now, I know this typically sounds like word salad in the beginning, and to be honest, what's funny is that that's actually his second try. His first try was in this book, Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals. And this was such a notoriously difficult text to understand, he had to write another one called The Critique of Practical Reason, which is the one I'm pulling from for this lesson. In any case, it is a little hard to understand. We'll work together to make sure we understand it. But let me just kind of say this part real quick. I'll take it from the slides. For Kant, to be immoral is to be irrational. Some actions are of such a nature that their maxim cannot even be thought as a universal law of nature without contradiction. In other words, there are some things that merely engaging in that behavior is inconsistent if you kind of, zoom out and look at, the whole context of what you're doing. So let me take maybe one of my favorite Kantian interpreters, Christine Korsgaard. Let me take her way of interpreting Kant as our launching point, because I really do like her work, and I think she's maybe the clearest on interpreting what the heck Kant is saying. So I'll take this here from the slides. The test is carried out by imagining, in effect, that the action you propose to perform in order to carry out your purpose is a standard procedure for carrying out that purpose. What the test shows to be forbidden are just those actions whose efficacy in achieving their purposes depends upon their being exceptional. If the action no longer works as a way of achieving the purpose in question when it is universalized, then it is an action of this kind. Intuitively speaking, the test reveals unfairness, deception, and cheating. So maybe you're thinking this is equally unclear. It's actually, once you break it down, pretty simple. You just consider an action any action, right? Consider what principle motivated that action. And then ask yourself, would willing that everyone act upon this principle make it so that I would no longer be able to engage in the action? If yes, the action is morally wrong. If no, the action is, maybe I shouldn't say right, maybe I should say permissible. So what's going on here? Well, let me give you my favorite example, and it's from something that I used to love to do, which is theater hop when I was a youngster. And the idea here is very simple. So what motivated my action of theater hopping? Well, I wanted to watch the movie, and I was young. I didn't have money to pay for it, or I didn't want to pay for it. So, well, what would happen if everyone did that? Well, if everyone that wanted to watch movies but didn't want to pay for it, which is essentially everyone, if everyone did that, then guess what wouldn't get made anymore? Movies, because they wouldn't make any money. So if everyone did what I was doing, then I wouldn't be able to do what I was doing. If everyone didn't pay for movies, then I wouldn't get to watch movies because they wouldn't exist. Certainly not the ones that I liked. So that's what Kant is saying here, and Christine Korsgaard is interpreting him as saying. Some things, if you were to get everyone to do them, would no longer allow you to do them. And that would be an inconsistency. You're creating an exception for yourself. Well, I want everyone else to pay for movies, but I'm not going to pay for movies. That's what makes it unfair. That's why it's not universalizable. That's the idea. Of course, lying is more of a Kantian example. It's also the example that Christine Korsgaard uses. But lying, of course, assumes that most people actually do tell the truth. The reason why lying works is that people are assuming that you are actually being truthful. And if you are a compulsive liar and people already know your nature, then you already know that it becomes harder and harder to lie because people don't trust what you say. So here's the way you test this. Is lying okay? Well, what would happen if everyone lied? Well, people wouldn't believe each other anymore. So then lying wouldn't work. Right? So there it is, again, not universalizable. Stealing. Well, what would happen if everyone stole? Well, private property would be pretty difficult as a concept. It probably wouldn't exist anymore if it was just getting stolen willy-nilly. And so, of course, that is, if no one has private property anymore, well, then you wouldn't be able to steal. So again, not universalizable. So these are, some pretty classic Kantian examples. And I want to just kind of give you a table here that I use, when discussing this. These are kind of obvious ones, right? Murder is clearly not universalizable. If everyone that found it convenient to kill someone were to kill, well, then they wouldn't be able to kill probably because they would have already been dead by that point. So assault, similar to murder. Drug abuse, there's actually kind of a better justification for drug abuse according to another formulation of the categorical imperative. So I'll actually talk about drug abuse a little bit later, but these are clearly morally wrong for Kant, and these are morally permissible. That's what I'm going to say. Not morally right, but permissible. And honestly, honesty is just the flip side of lying. So some of these are the flip side of the morally wrong action. So protect life, murder, right? Those are, kind of the flip sides of each other. So with this said, I think it's a good time to mention here that Kant actually does make a distinction that I haven't mentioned yet. We have a perfect duty to not act according to maxims which are self-contradictory. For example, stealing, right? But there's also imperfect duties, which are, the word is supererogatory. In other words, you don't receive blame if you don't complete them, but you will get moral praise if you do, like developing your talents. So here is the table again. And I wish it were that simple that I can just say the things on the right-hand side are perfect duties that you can never do, and the things on the left are imperfect duties that are supererogatory. But things are never that simple with Kant. What are some things that are... So on the right, those are definitely perfect duties. You may not lie, you may not steal, etc., etc. But on the left, honesty just is the flip side of lying, right? So you actually do have to be honest. That is also a perfect duty. What's an imperfect duty? What is morally supererogatory? Well, develop your talents. That would be morally supererogatory. You don't have to do it, but you do get moral praise if you do. You get some kudos if you do. Self-defense, though. Self-defense is a perfect duty. You actually do have to defend your autonomy. That's, a command from reason. So this distinction right here between perfect duties and imperfect duties, it's a really good one to notice. And we usually focus on the perfect duties, things you're not allowed to do, but it is important to note that the Kantian system does give you some imperfect duties as well. Okay, next formulation, the humanity formulation. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. My favorite example of this, and this restaurant, by the way, is Amor y Tacos in Cerritos. My favorite example of this, of course, is treating your wait staff well. People that treat their wait staff poorly, I think there's a special level of hell just for you. Clearly, you must treat people with respect, even when they are a means to an end. I mean, your server is to get you your food, right? So you can have a good time when you're out. But never treat them merely as a means to an end. They're still human beings, right? With autonomy and interests and a welfare that they care about. So sure, if they're getting you something, if they are there to serve you, that's okay. But you shouldn't treat them merely as that. Also, always respect their humanity. So just don't use people. That's kind of the easiest way to put it. So that's the humanity formulation. And if you think about it, anything that, let's just look at the perfect duties here on the right-hand side. Anything here, don't lie, don't steal, that is just as easily concluded using the humanity formulation. So when you lie to someone, when you lie to your boss to get out of work or whatever, you're using them, right? So don't use them. That's the humanity formulation. When you steal, you're using people. You're using people's work to get money, to get the thing that you stole, right? And my favorite example here is drug abuse. When you are abusing drugs, you are using someone. You are using yourself. You are putting your body at risk for pleasure. Okay, right around this point, I do like to talk about some famous Kantians. Now, I'm not an expert in any of these things, so I know that Captain America in the comic books was kind of a rule follower, and I think in the comic books. In the movies, I guess he began as a rule follower. By the time he got to Infinity War, he was a little more rebellious. In any case, Captain America probably... kind of a Kantian, especially the comic book version. 3PO. So, I mean, the whole point of this droid is to, when you go to different planets, you follow their rules. He translates for you, he tells you what to do, how not to commit any faux pas, right? So, that's definitely a rule follower. Forrest Gump, obviously, I saw the movie, but a long time ago, but it seems like, he's kind of one of those, we have some things that we do and some things that we don't do. So that seems like a Kantian kind of reasoner to me. I don't really watch The Simpsons, but Ned Flanders, from what I have seen, seems like a rule follower. Maybe the best example, because they explicitly say he's a Kantian, is Chidi from The Good Place. So if you've ever seen this show, obviously that's a little difficult for you to realize this. But just watch an episode, and he's maybe the most Kantian character in pop culture in general. And just think about these characters. And just try to imagine them doing any of these things. Think about Chidi trying to do any of the things on the right-hand side. It's basically impossible. I mean, it just won't happen. So, okay, let's look at the autonomy formulation. And this is one that Kant didn't exactly give a formulation of this in this way, but some commentators, and I have the notes, on the actual Canvas lesson, they kind of read it out of Kant. They say, oh, he kind of meant this too. So here's what it is. Act so that through your maxims, you could be a legislator of universal laws. Note, the idea behind this formulation is to stress the source of human dignity, that we are lawgivers. And to be universal lawgivers, we must be maximally impartial or fair. So I think the autonomy formulation is pretty valid. I mean, you can read it out of Kant for sure. And the idea here, and I kind of do like it, is that you're almost blending the first two formulations, right? You got to stress human dignity. Don't use people and don't use yourself. You are a lawgiver. And so if you kind of put it in that context, I think it's a good way to kind of think about the categorical imperative. And in any case, let's finish up here with the increasingly popular formulation, the kingdom of ends formulation. Every rational being must act as if he were by his maxims at all times a law-giving member of the universal kingdom of ends. So first thing I should say is, I'm sorry for the sexist language there, the he. This is the way Kant put it. He or she, let's put it that way. In any case, just imagine a society where everyone treats each other as ends in and of themselves, right? No one uses each other, and everyone is also a lawgiver. What kind of maxims would they follow? That's the idea here. And this is an increasingly popular formulation ever since apparently the work of John Rawls, who is a political philosopher. I think it is kind of a good formulation in that it just compels you to ask yourself, like, just imagine a perfect society, a perfectly moral society. What kind of maxims would people follow? And yeah, it turns out, you wouldn't lie, you wouldn't steal, you certainly wouldn't murder, right? So I think this is a good formulation. And all of these, I think, help you kind of wrap your mind around the kind of things that Kant thinks you shouldn't do, the perfect duties, and even those things that it would be really nice if you did, right? The imperfect duties.